Morning, everyone. Let's see. Okay. Let's fix my audio. Okay, good morning, everyone. It's 9 o'clock in the East. Do you know where your children are? We are beginning. And I do believe that my friend Jordan Hoggard will join me after a bit, but I'll start the bidding with a reading from, I'm using Mystical Path Less Traveled, a Jungian psychological perspective. Actually, I sort of feel that Jerry pulled the pitch on that title because he should have just left it as a mystical path less traveled and not involved the Jungian stuff afterward, because that dilutes it. And the fact is that this is reality as far as how religions were born. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read his journal here step by step. And assuming Jordan joins me, that will be great. But if he doesn't, I'll certainly respond to any questions that you folks put on to the chat on YouTube. And so the first segment from Jerry Wright's book is, for more than 13 billion years, there existed what we have named the natural world. When our species came online, so to speak, we gave names to our experiences of that numinous world. In this way, we created all our gods and goddesses, deities and devils, and religions. Now we are tasked with being responsible channels or conduits of those powers and presences that we discovered and named. This is what it means to be human, to be responsible channels of the numinous powers and presences of the cosmos. In this way, we accept our role as co-creators of the future. It is a tall order, both our glory and our burden. So, any questions about that before I comment on it? None. Okay, let me welcome everybody on the YouTube chat. Okay, moving right along. Okay, so Jerry's point here is that if we look at evolution, there was no all-encompassing Godhead at the beginning. There was the Big Bang, and nothing had been named. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. And so what happened as our species started to gain consciousness is that everything on the planet needed to be named, including numerous experiences and ideas. And that includes all gods and goddesses, deities and devils, and religions. And so what we are living in now, 4 to 7 million years later, whether you accept that or not, is we're living in the consequences of what we named and how we named those things back in the day. And so this is, Jordan Peterson hasn't quite gotten this far, unfortunately. He has operated as a clinical psychologist. He's had to follow a lot of the rules, and he's gone quite far with maps of meaning, surely. And he's gone less far with his rules because there weren't any rules. It took 10 billion years before our planet was even formed. And after it was formed, it took, there are various guesses, but, a while before the first living creature existed, the first creature that could reproduce itself. And that is a critical factor. And so all species, and we now have about 8 million of them on this planet, all species have been following one rule of nature, and that rule is survive until you reproduce. Survive until you reproduce. And so all have done that, and every single-celled organism with every other single-celled organism started to mutate, if you will. I mean, we're seeing it now in the COVID arena, but all of them mutated, but continued to reproduce right down the line for billions of years. And finally, about 4 to 7 million years ago, depending on whose book you read, human beings started to be a recognized species. And so we have Lucy, whose skull was found in the Olduvai Gorge of Tanzania, I think, Ethiopia, that area, about 4 million years ago. And there's some evidence that there were other early men that maybe existed before that, men and women, of course, because you don't get one without the other. And so consciousness, as we know it in the modern context, people think that actually started to evolve about 200,000 years ago, when human beings could actually come up with notions that they could put out there which weren't touchable in the physical world. And so by a time 3,500 years ago, which is like blink in terms of human history is when we have Abraham and Isaac and the foundation of the three Abrahamic religions. And Hagar, who was the woman whose life Islam looks back to, was Abraham's slave. And, human beings were pretty nasty in those days. And when Sarah finally was able to produce another child, or a child, because she had gotten quite old and had not produced a child, Abraham's first son was Ishmael, and he was the son of Hagar. But then Abraham's wife, Sarah, was able to have a child, and so Abraham just chased Hagar into the desert. God knows where that actually was, but in any case, Hagar's story after that time, which is about 3,500 years ago, is a story of survival in the desert. And in Islam, the Hajj, which is a duty of all Muslims, is about following the story of Hagar and how she survived. And so the result of that is that when she got to Mecca, God gave her a well, among other things, gave her a well. And by tradition, that well has produced water ever since the time of Hagar, 3,500 years ago. And so when Muslims go on Hajj, many of them who are not Saudi citizens take literally a 5-gallon jerry can of water from that well back to their families and to their communities, because it's considered to be quite sacred. And so I've been on many air flights out of Saudi Arabia into India, for example, and those very often in the baggage section, when you're grabbing your baggage, you'll see 20 or 30 or 40 jerry cans that are full of water from that well. And that's what the pilgrimage is about. And part of the reason to talk about this a little bit today is that tomorrow, depending on where you are in the world, tomorrow and Tuesday is Eid al-Adha. Now that's a sacred moment like Christmas in the Muslim world. And it celebrates, what it specifically celebrates is the survival of Ishmael, and the fact that that he and his mother got away from Abraham and his people. And what the Muslims believe is that it was Ishmael who was almost sacrificed on the mountain by Abraham. Of course, for Jews and Christians, the son is Isaac, and that's the son of Sarah, but Muslims believe that the son that was saved was Ishmael. And we should all, whichever it is, and none of us were there, so none of us can say for sure, but whichever it is, it's the end of human sacrifice in the Abrahamic religious world. In other words, for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, that was the end of human sacrifice, which up until then, human beings, for whatever reason, thought that they could give their children, give their sons, their first son, to God by literally sacrificing them. And of course, in the Aztec world, it was daughters that they were sacrificing. But human sacrifice went on around the world for millions of years to propitiate the gods. In other words, to satisfy the gods that you're paying attention to them, and you won't fall off the wagon, so to speak. And so it was a sign of devotion to sacrifice your child, wherever it was done in the world, and it was done everywhere essentially. But in the world of the Abrahamic religions, the survival of Isaac or Ishmael from Abraham's thinking that he had to sacrifice him is the saving of them, whichever it was the end of human sacrifice. And after that, the Jews found that they could sacrifice a goat. And so, long story there. But anyway, we all, whether we're Jews or Christians or Muslims, should celebrate Eid al-Adha, because it is a celebration of the end of human sacrifice in the world, at least for the Abrahamic religions. And, that's a part of the story that you heard it here first, probably, but nonetheless, it's true. And it satisfies me very much. And I had a Muslim woman visiting here. She was actually sleeping in this room 2 summers ago on Eid al-Adha. And that morning, she came out of this room with a big grin on her face and a big smile and said, "It's Eid." Well, of course, traveling many times in the Middle East, I knew that Eid was quite a sacred time for Muslims, but I didn't know why. And I said, okay, which Eid is it? Because there's Eid al-Fitr, which is right after Ramadan, and then there's Eid al-Adha, which is approximately 8 weeks after Ramadan. And so she said it was Eid al-Adha, and so that got me wondering what the event is that it's honoring. Like Christmas, we honor the birth of Christ, of course, if we're Christians, and it turns out that's what it is. It's the date that Abraham refused to sacrifice his son, regardless of which son it was, and ended human sacrifice in the Abrahamic religions. If you have comments or questions, don't hesitate to put them in the YouTube chat. Jordan had said that he was going to join us, but and that was only an hour ago, but something may have come up and he hasn't been able to do that. So I will continue on with my soliloquy. That's how all this started anyway, and there seem to be a few people listening, so I'll continue to give my teaching. So what Jerry says is that what came up from the numinous world is that we as human beings have to be responsible. And this is what Jordan Peterson says. I don't think he's put together why from a historical context that is, or if he has, I haven't heard him say it. But in any case, this is, the reason is that the purpose of our lives is to live our lives, among other things. And so when we're infants, when we're born, we are wild animals, and our parents have to teach us how to live in this world, regardless of who we are. And so very slowly, we're slow learners. We learn to talk and to walk as compared to other animals, because I think most four-legged animals can walk away from the time they're born, but human infants can't even crawl until about age 2, I think. And so, or even stand at least for a year. And, that just wouldn't do in the animal world, obviously. And so we've created strategies for our species to survive during that critical and vulnerable time when we're 1 to 3 years old, for sure. And we really need that help until we're fully mature adults. And so we learn, we actually go through 6 phases of religious understanding, or let's call it, for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to call it 5 stages of consciousness. And we're only just now getting into the 5th stage, but let me go through the first 4 stages. So the first stage, we all go through this from infancy. The first stage is participatio mystique. And what that means is that we've got no idea what's going on, but we just do like mom and dad do. And we're not even conscious of ourselves as a separate individual or separate creature. We're just in the flow with our parents. And so the next stage of human consciousness and religious thinking is that your parents become the gods and goddesses. And in my case, when I was 5 years old, we were quite challenged. My mother was 25 years old at the time. I was born when she had just turned 20. And my father had orders, reassignment orders in the Navy to Kodiak, Alaska. But my grandparents, both sets of grandparents, lived in Philadelphia. And in the previous 3 years, we had been assigned to the Mojave Desert in California, go figure. The reason was that I was thought to have asthma at that time. It turns out in modern medicine, it's been discovered. It's partially why I have a gravelly voice, but modern medicine gradually discovered that most asthma is caused by allergy. And I actually have lots of allergies. When I was skin tested for allergy a few years ago, let's call it 20 years ago now, I've done it many times. So I'm almost 75 now. And so 50 years ago was the first time that I've been skin tested. But this last time, 20 years ago or so, my allergy doctor said that I was one of 3 patients out of 10,000 that had tested allergic to everything they tested. And, that's quite bizarre because, I served a full career in the Marine Corps, 23 years. And I did serve in Vietnam, which is a jungle, but the point is that my immune system doesn't see the foliage in Vietnam as enemy. So it accepts it for a period of time. About a year into living in a new location, I start to develop allergies usually. And so anyway, 20 years ago, when I came to Annapolis, Maryland, I was tested. And as I say, I was one of 3 patients in that allergist's experience that was allergic to everything they tested in me. And as a result of that, I get 2 shots every 2 weeks. So average 1 shot a week for the rest of my life. For the last 20 years and the rest of my life, I have to have these injections in order to avoid asthma and dying. And so, which I do it, I don't mind doing it anymore. I rather like it because every time I get the injections, I feel better. And that lasts a couple of weeks, and then I go back and get jammed again, and I feel better again instantly, by the way. What I was amazed about was 50 years ago when I had my first set of skin tests. The doctor gave me the skin tests, and I walked out the door of his office, and it made me feel better already. I was better already. And that has consistently worked for me, that my immune system will stand down and and cause my body to accept the things in my environment. Anyway, but anyway, going back to when I was 2, I did have asthma, and the Navy, in its infinite wisdom, sent my father to the Mojave Desert, to Edinger, where now the state of California has a penitentiary in Edinger, but the Navy also has a major base where they test various things, airplanes and explosives and naval guns and that sort of thing. And so my father at that time was, I think he was still an ensign or a lieutenant JG in the Navy. And so he was the paymaster of the base for that 3-year period. And then he got assigned to Kodiak, Alaska. So just imagine the difference in environment from a totally desert environment to a totally rain environment. It isn't that Kodiak is so cold because it's in the Gulf of Alaska, but it is in the Japanese current. And so it has 140 inches of rain every year. Okay, so Jordan is not going to join us today. He's had the funeral of his father yesterday, and his family is gathered, and so I'm going to do this solo today. So let's see. I'm happy to answer or respond to any comments or questions you have. But the story is that by the time we were prepared to change locations, my mother had been away from Philadelphia for 3 years, hadn't been able to visit her parents for 3 years. And so we literally drove from Inyo to Philadelphia. And then my father had duty to perform in the Navy. And so he flew from Philadelphia to Kodiak, leaving my mother and 3 children in Philadelphia. And the plan was, at that time, you had to show up in Seattle in order to get shipping to Kodiak. And we didn't fly people around everywhere in those days. So you had to catch a ship from Seattle to Kodiak. And so my mother was tasked at age 25 with 3 children, the eldest of whom was me at age 5, to drive from Philadelphia to Seattle. And it was quite an adventurous trip. But I remember driving across Montana at one stage in this trip. And I remember looking up at my mother and seeing her as a goddess. I didn't have words for it at that time, but I had this numinous experience that she was a goddess. And, I couldn't say that at the time, but as I reflect on that incident. So at about that age, 4 or 5, one sees their parents as gods and goddesses. So then, as you get a little older, your parents start you in some sort of religious training, Sunday school and that sort of thing. And so the third stage of consciousness is to accept some outside authority other than your parents as the gods. And so my family wasn't hugely religious. My mother used to give Jewish prayers as grace before we ate, but we were never Jewish. We aren't Jewish. We're both sides are Protestant families. And so we went to Navy chapels, which were non-denominational. And so obviously they were talking about God and Christ, but in Navy chapels, there's no distinction among the various Christian sects. And the Catholic service is done at another time. So in the case of the U.S. Naval Academy here, at 10 a.m. they have the Catholic service, and on that, at that time, the cross has Christ hanging on the cross, But when the Protestant service starts, they turn the cross around and it has no Christ hanging on the cross. And that's how they do the Protestant service. And so, that was the type of religious upbringing that I had for many years. And so the point is that when you're, I don't know, between 5 and 10, you start to find out that there are gods outside of your immediate nuclear family. And so, but what happened in kind of early in the 19th century, and it had been happening for 300 years before, was that the scientific method became more and more precise over the 500 years after Galileo. And so Galileo himself was called up before the Inquisition. And if you don't know of the abjuration of Galileo Galilei, I urge you to find it on Google, because it's actually a hilarious document where he was brought up before the Inquisition. He was made to kneel before the inquisitor and put his hand on the Bible and swear that the sun orbited the earth as opposed to the earth orbiting the sun. He had to swear to that on a Bible. And so the Catholics kept good records at that time. And so we know what he said. And it's quite amusing because he did exactly what he was told. And as a result of that fact, they didn't burn him at the stake. Instead, they banished him and made him sort of live in home confinement for 4 years before he died. And during that time, he invented 2 new sciences, one of which is quantum mechanics, or quantum physics. And so Galileo was quite a guy, and he was doing all this science, and gradually that permeated out through Western Europe. And so as it did more and more, it made it made the stories that sorry, it made the stories that religious teachers were telling in their churches more and more credulous. And so by the time Nietzsche came around at the end of the 19th century, he was only stating facts that already existed in Western Europe, as Dr. Jung said. And he said that God is dead and we have killed him. And what he meant by that was that the God that had been sold for 2,000 years, or actually 3,500 years by the Abrahamic religions, that was all a story. It was a story done for early Iron Age men to try to be able to understand their place in nature. And it worked for quite a long time, about, I guess it was 3,000 years. But then, and maybe before that, but then when the scientific method came along, people would do some experiment and then they'd have to think back on what the priest was saying and say, no, it isn't like that. And that sense had permeated Western Europe by that time, by the end of the 19th century. And so this is exactly what Nietzsche was saying, that you know, that God doesn't exist. But he did know, and Carl Jung knew, that God is really within us. It's within us. And so Dr. Jung came along a generation later from Nietzsche and basically said not only is God alive, but this is where he lives and how he goes about doing the work of the Godhead. And so that's one of the fundamental stories of Jungian psychology, that the impetus to have a religion is innate, it's instinctive in the human species. But the stories that we've been told to get to that place are fictitious. They're novels that primitive men accepted, let's say. And so I know from my own experience, when I was about 30, I became a deacon in the Reformed Church, the same church. Well, I guess it's not exactly the same church, but a Reformed church similar to Paul Vanderklay, and also similar to the church of which Dr. Jung's father was a pastor. And so I was in that church in my local community, and I became a deacon. And so one day I was alone with the pastor, and I said, can you describe God to me? Because I was having these problems that all young men, or most young men, do start to have, because we're very rationally oriented and logically oriented. And he couldn't do it. He couldn't tell me what he thought God was. And it was a total mishmash response. And so that sort of put me off about religion at that point. And I continued to follow along for another few years because I was having children at that time, and I wanted to raise moral children. And so I stuck with it, but in sort of a doubtful mode. And as Jerry says in his book here, it's a story that's best before age 30. After age 30, you start to have questions and doubts. And that's what all of us get to eventually. And so therefore, we need Dr. Jung's perspective on psychology to understand what it is that this instinct is that we have, and what should we do about it. And so, but the problem was, after Nietzsche, with God dead, then we had the horrific and murderous 20th century, where human beings killed 280 million people in the century in violent warfare. World Wars I, II, Vietnam, Korea, and lots of wars in other parts of the world. And it was just a carnage. Joseph Stalin, who had sold his people on socialism and on communism, once he got in power, just murdered people that didn't agree with him. And he killed 20 million of his own people. And so the result was what we have today. And so we need to find our way back to how to handle our natural instincts. So, but anyway, the fourth stage of consciousness was the stage in which we tended to become atheists or agnostic, and people didn't know what the hell to think anymore in the 20th century. And so the fifth stage of consciousness is a stage in which we figure out, as Jordan Peterson does say, that we have to, when we reach adulthood, we have to take responsibility. We have to step up and be responsible for our world and not rely on God or anybody else to create the world that we want. Now, I have to apologize, but I'm going to need to take a bio break here. When you have the kind of medical treatment I'm going through, when you have a call of nature, it means right now. And so I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. So apologies. I only lost 2 in that time. Boy, when you undergo some of these medical procedures, you get up close and personal experience with the fact that we are in fact animals, and we have a body, and we're not going to live forever. And so anyway, where was I? Okay, I was talking about the 5th stage of consciousness. So the 5th stage is to look back and realize that, as Jordan Peterson does correctly say, once we reach adulthood, which in the United States, at the age of 18, you're old enough to serve your country. And, therefore, you're considered an adult, even though some states don't allow you to start drinking until you're 21. But in any case, if you're a male and 18 years old in the United States, then you're eligible for the draft if we ever had a draft again. And so you're considered an adult. And so this is why Dr. Peterson talks about you have to pick up a load. You have to learn how to pick up a load. I don't think he quite explains it, sort of the rationale and the narrative of it as well as I have, I hope. But he's 99.5% of the time I agree with him entirely. Only 0.5% of the time do I say, no, you're missing something. So I have tremendous respect for Dr. Peterson. And when he talks about picking up a load, this is what he means, that when we reach our majority, so that we're adults, we have to take responsibility. And we can't just shirk it. We can't hide it off on a god, on a religious figure, and expect him to pluck us out of our situation, or make us successful sports stars. The God that makes you a successful sports star is here in your heart. It's not in. It is not up there. If you think you're pointing at God when you make a touchdown by pointing in that direction, you're pointing in the wrong direction, because the God that gets you to the goal line in an important football game or any other important activity that you might take, be successful in, is the God of your heart, the God that is internal. And those prayers are actually petitions to yourself to perform well. So anyway, yes, Big Cat says, it's amazing how the young can be so thoroughly indoctrinated. Yes, we've been doing that for the last 40 years, primarily on television, on network television, and later from the year 2000 on, perhaps on cable news or cable television. So we're doing all of our education, all of the hard, heavy lifting of our education through movies and TV shows. And I know that's how I learned a lot of things. When something happens, when X happens, I almost always have an image from a movie that I've seen come to mind. and says, you know, this is like what's happening was happening to you then. And that helps you put it into context so you're aware of what's going on. And so it's a kind of teaching. Yeah, Peterson does leave the spiritual realm out. And Paul Vanderklay has been licking his chops for about 9 months, thinking that Jordan Peterson is on the verge of declaring himself a Christian and a believer in God. And I know absolutely that he will never do that. Or if he does do that, he's gone over to the dark side. Because first of all, the reason I don't think he'll do it is he's got 3 million followers. And if he declares himself as a Christian, he's going to turn off probably a quarter of his base. And so instead of 3 million followers, he'll have 2.25 million followers, something like that. Hi, Penelope. Nice to see you today. And Charlie says, children start asking existential questions almost as soon as they talk. Yes, and I really recommend, if you're just going into parenthood age, I really urge you to keep a notebook handy when your children reach like 2 or 2.5 years old, because they do say amazing things that come from their deep unconscious. And if you were to write those down, you'd have a bestseller book. They're always profound and funny. Of course, when you're a parent, it's an extra task to try to make notes like that. But I urge you to try to do that, and because as they say, out of the mouths of babes, and because they have no indoctrination yet, so they just say exactly what comes to mind. So anyway, well, and one, I would say that speaking the truth is the only way to go. It's his truth. I do agree with that, but his truth is that none of the Abrahamic religions are the truth, or not. They're not 100% true. And he knows that because he's a psychologist. And so he can't bring himself to talk about it in that way. And that's one of the reasons that when asked if he's a Jungian, I say absolutely not. He's picked up a few nice quotes from Jung, and he uses them liberally in his lectures. But it's like if you have a meme on Twitter that you like, you know, is that running your life or not, or is it just amusement? And so with Dr. Jung's depth psychology, you need to understand him much deeper than the memes about him that go around. And as Penelope rightly says here, the Red Book is magical, and I've done a lot of work on this station with the Red Book. I've read it cover to cover in front of this camera. And so if you want to hear me read the Red Book, you'll find that. Plus, I've done many other videos on the Red Book, or on the series subsequent to the Red Book, which is called Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And my friend Thomas Arst, who was a co-editor of that series for, they're going to be 5 volumes. I have 4 of them so far, but he was co-editor of the series. And the very first essay in the series, which is in volume 1 of Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, that essay, which is about 35 pages long, and I have read it into this YouTube channel in 2 videos because it's quite long. It's a brilliant essay, and it brilliantly puts us in the context of where we are in human development. So I urge you to go listen to my reading of it if you don't have the book handy. Charlie says he first heard the Red Book here. Well, thank you. Glad to hear it. And Ann says, I think I could be spiritual, not religious. He should say how close he feels to the afterlife. I think we've gone beyond spiritual, not religious, in the sense that when if you go to the gym, you can find a yin yoga teacher or any yoga teacher, and those teachers can teach yoga in a very superficial manner. And we have yoga instructors in Nebraska and Oklahoma, all over the United States. And basically what they're teaching is fundamental Hinduism. That's what they're teaching. And you can feel spiritual but not religious if you go to one of those classes, because they never admit that they're teaching Hinduism. They make you feel like it's spiritual. And so we had Dr. Jason Smith a few weeks ago live on this channel, and you can find the video of his talk in our Wisdom Path playlist. And Dr. Smith, his book is called Religious but Not Religious. So in other words, he means that you need to develop in your own life what is going to be meaningful to you. But that doesn't mean that it's any existing proselytized religion on the planet. And we all have to do it individually. And so, it's something like a smorgasbord, because you take this from Group B, A, and this from Group B, and this from Group C. And if that satisfies you, then you're good. You've got a religion then, but it's a religion for one person. Thank you, Penelope, for your kind remark. And you're right, we do see God in flowers. But anyway, we have to get past the 4th stage of consciousness, which was nihilism. And that's what we had in the 20th century that got 280 million people killed. And so we need to develop something beyond that. And the way to go at the moment is to do it individually for yourself and decide what satisfies you about all these topics. Right. And Big Cat says, in my opinion, people on the spiritual path should create their own red book using their personal dreams as a large portion of the content. And that is precisely what Dr. Jung recommended. So he says right in the first chapter of the Red Book, don't follow my path. My path might be wrong, and it might be wrong for you, but you need to make your own Red Book. And of course, Dr. Arst's essay at the beginning of Jung's Red Book for Our Time says exactly that. That's the recommendation of Dr. Jung himself, that said you should create your own Red Book. Okay, peace, Penelope. Anyway, Goran's asked me what my take is on Kingsley's catafalque. And I think I agree with Peter Kingsley 100%. I wanted to talk about his book on this YouTube channel many times, but Peter called me up and threatened me with copyright suits and all sorts of other crap. So I just left it alone. And when Peter's ready for me to comment on catafalque or have him on the wisdom path, he's more than welcome. And I agree with everything he said in catafalque. And so I think it's a great 2-volume book. And volume 1 is really the guts of the book. Volume 2 is the footnotes, believe it or not. It's all quite wonderful, but because of his stricture, I am not allowed to read it on this YouTube channel, and I haven't gotten that permission as yet. I think at some point, Peter may come to his senses and realize that when I do that, it's actually a long infomercial for his book, and it will get people to go out and buy it, which I urge you to do. But until he changes his mind, I'm stuck not doing it. Now, someone here asked about the afterlife. Oh, it was N who said, I think he could be spiritual, not religious. He should say how close he feels to the afterlife. Well, let me say what Dr. Jung said, and then what my opinion is. And mind you, I do live with my wife, who is a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and who has completed a 3-year retreat in Tibetan Buddhism. So in effect, she's had the teachings of any Lama, but she never took ordination because she's married to me, thankfully. But so I'm really steeped in Buddhist tradition and in death. I have death around me all the time, including I have it in my hand right now, because this is my Tibetan Buddhist mala, which is the beads on my mala are skulls. And it goes to the point of the medieval monks who, when they woke up in the morning, would say to one another, memento mori, which means remember death. And Dr. Jung's point is that you have to live in this life. Don't wait for the afterlife, because, well, he doesn't say the because, but I'm going to say the because. The because, you're just deluding yourself if you think there is an afterlife. There's no creature on earth that has immortal life. And so if you're going to live in an afterlife, it has to be in the spirit. And that means it has to be by you passing your spirit down the ages, as many famous people did. I mean, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama obviously did it. Jesus Christ did it. Abraham did it. Job did it. And so we still know, thanks to ancient writings, what those people thought, and their spirits about what they thought still live here on the earth, planet Earth, and in our hearts, one way or another. And this includes Carl Jung and Ludwig van Beethoven and Mozart and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who Dr. Peterson keeps mentioning. Well, when he does that, he's passing Solzhenitsyn's spirit down the generations. And very frankly, the reason I started this YouTube channel was precisely so that I could pass some ideas on to my grandchildren to help them with their lives, since my youngest grandchild is only 2 years old now. And so, and I'm 75, so she's not going to be of age until I'm 91. And so, knock on wood, I can get there, but I'd rather make sure that while I have the energy, I record some of my thoughts so that she can find them later on. But that's me passing my spirit down through the generations. And it isn't because I expect to go play the harp up in the sky. That ain't going to happen. And so my favorite saying on this is, when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family. When you're stupid, it works the same way. So understanding the psychology of human nature is surely essential for any modern man or woman to understand their lives and to have a connection with the divine, with something greater than themselves. The big question, as Jung said, the big question for a human is, are you connected to something divine and universal, or are you not? And of course, his answer, of course, was yes. And so he left us, in the original version, 20 volumes of the collected works, and there's going to be a new edition that's going to have, I think, 26 volumes. Plus, there's 2 volumes of vision lectures, 2 volumes of lectures on Nietzsche and Thus Spake Zarathustra. And keeping in mind that Nietzsche wrote a book that's 200 pages long, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Jung's lectures on Zarathustra are 1,600 pages. And so it's something like the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon, before he went on his Russia campaign, wrote down the law, basically, very much like Moses had done. And it was only a couple pages long at the most. I don't actually know its original size, but it was quite short. When he came back from Russia, his aides brought him 10,000 pages of the Napoleonic Code. And Napoleon says, how's that possible? That's not what I left you with. And the aide says, Messire, il vit, it lives. And so all of us live in one way or another. Hi, Tammy, nice to see you today. You've missed all the fireworks here, but let's see. Okay. So that's what I think about the afterlife. I'm preparing for the afterlife by recording my spirit to pass down the generations. And so as long as YouTube keeps going, I presume my videos will be available. But I know that, when I'm on my deathbed and finally lose consciousness, that's it for me as a creature. So it's only my spirit that will live on. Let's see. So a video of him interviewed by Mary Stein. Was very impressed. Who was interviewed by Mary Stein, and I don't quite follow that part of your conversation. Big Cat, if you believe that you will go to heaven in a way that is heaven itself, yeah, and heaven, as Jesus Christ himself said, heaven is spread upon the earth and men do not see it. And so, yes, you're living in heaven. And I think, millions of people have been sold a story by the various religions that we have and have gone to their death thinking they're going to, die on their deathbed and wake up in heaven and everything's going to be hunky-dory and they can go on experiencing things, which is not the case. But yes, I agree that if you will believe in, you will go to heaven, yeah, that might be heaven itself, and because it gives you hope and we do have heaven is spread upon the earth. And so you need to step back and say, okay, if this is heaven, how can we improve it a little bit? So anyhow, okay. Given the fact that I don't have a talking partner today, because of Jordan's funeral of his father, and because of the limitations on my voice, I probably have done enough damage for one day. So I'm going to discontinue this session at this point. And Tammy, I'm sorry you missed it, but it's going to be available on replay as soon as I log off, actually. And, YouTube will start to present it, within the next hour. And so, I think you might find it interesting to listen to what I've said, this has been basically a stream of consciousness on what Jerry Wright said in this book, A Mystical Path Less Traveled. And I'll just read again the journal entry that I was commenting on. And his journal says, for more than 13 billion years, there existed what we have named the natural world. When our species came online, so to speak, we gave names to our experiences of that numinous world. In this way, we created all of our gods and goddesses, deities and devils, and religions. Now we are tasked with being responsible channels or conduits of those powers and presences that we discovered and named. This is what it means to be human, to be responsible channels of the numinous powers and presences of the cosmos. In this way, we accept our role as co-creators of the future. It is a tall order, both our glory and our burden. So I agree with that statement, absolutely. So Tammy, when you say you're reading his first book, do you mean the volume 1 of Catafalque, or do you mean Peter Kingsley's first book at all? Okay, so the first volume of Catafalque is the entire message. The second volume of Catafalque is the footnotes, which amount to the proofs of what his message is. So I urge you to read it. It's a very good book, and I do agree with it 100%, believe it or not. But I have not reviewed it nor talked about it on this channel at Peter's specific request on the telephone. And so, okay, Peter, that's the way you want it. Fine. Now, when you're ready, I'm ready to have you on the wisdom path. Yeah. Reimagining God and religion. Yeah, that's a good one. And thanks, Lee. Thanks, everyone. Peace. We'll be online tomorrow on our Tarot session over the summer while I'm in radiation treatment. Nick Lawrence has agreed to chair the process, and so I will be on briefly at the beginning and the end, but otherwise I'm going to be taking the lazy boy way out. And so you'll have all the other usual suspects if you're interested in the tarot. My radiation treatment ends on August 13th. And I can tell you, I'm looking forward to the day, but so far so good. And so peace. Take care now.